Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Joe Biden promised to be both the guy to promote unity and to be a transitional president. With the nation more divided than before he assumed office and Kamala Harris being arguably the most unpopular VP in modern history, he failed on both these pledges. But he may still be able to claim the moniker of a transformative president. He's transformed the border into no border, safe streets into crime-ridden war zones. And that was just with his pen and his phone. What other dubious treats await from the commander-in-chief? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's edition, we're talking blue strongholds on the brink, government interventionism, and take a guess at who's coming to dinner in Martha's Vineyard. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Hastings, Michigan on WBCH 1220 AM, 93.1 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. The coastal blue walls have long been reliable Democrat strongholds, and this is unlikely to change soon. But as scandals and disapproval haunt the elected leaders, are cracks beginning to form? Well, to fathom just how many fingers are needed to plug these particular holes, we're joined by Liberty Nation author Joe Schaefer, who's been watching the slow crumbling with a keen eye. Welcome back to the show, Joe.
Hello, Mark. Thanks for having me.
So tell me, is it true that these strongholds are showing signs of, let's call it voter fatigue?
I don't know if voter fatigue is the right word, but something very interesting is definitely going on. What you have, and the article I wrote about specifically mentioned Massachusetts and New York, two solidly blue states in which the Democrat candidates for governor are not controlling the narrative. They're on the defensive, they're on the run, and this is happening in states where they're easily going to win. I think it's a fascinating development. No one's talking about it, but even in states where they're most likely going to pick up two victories, Democrats are having an extremely difficult time getting their message across. And boy, I think that portends serious trouble in other races that are going to be a lot closer.
Yeah, I think we can use New York and Massachusetts as kind of a bellwethers, which they've never really been before, especially if you look at the polling for Lee Zeldin. And obviously, he's not close. He's not close to taking over for Governor Kathy Hochul. But the polling indicates, and pollings can be kind of funny, but that there's not as much of a gap as there should be, considering the number of registered Democrat voters in New York State. It's really quite something.
That's it exactly. And that's going to be the fascinating to see what the actual results are on November 8th. Kathy Hochul should be running away with this. She has everything to her advantage. And yet she has been on the defensive ever since she took the office from disgraced Andrew Cuomo last summer, summer of 2021. It is fascinating. Every move she has made has been a mistake. The lieutenant governor she chose right out of the bat was plagued with corruption. He had to actually step down after being arrested on bribery charges. She's got scandal in her own administration, very powerful reports out about her giving a sweetheart coronavirus test deal to a campaign donor. And so she smacks of machine politics. And this is another dynamic which is interesting.
Although in fairness, Joe, sorry to interrupt, that campaign donation, it's only fair to point out that the majority of it did come after they got the contract. So that's pretty fair.
Not all of it. A good portion of it came before that. But the higher point is when you have a state so controlled by one party, like New York, like Massachusetts, and then you have this specter of machine politics always there. They are the establishment. It's a bad look for Democrats. And then you add the crime situation in New York. It's just built for Lee Zeldin. Lee Zeldin just hit that out of the park. The viral headlines are just right there for his campaign. An axe-wielding maniac threatens people at a McDonald's in New York City, promptly gets released without bail. And Zeldin is just there to jump on it. He gives a press conference right outside of the McDonald's, and he says, you can see on their faces how scared people were. And you know what? There's viral video, went big on social media, and it shows exactly that. Regular people scared out of their minds. This guy's released without bail.
I saw an interview with the gentleman who wielded the axe, and he said, I've done my 18 hours. As if, and that really does, I think, hit the nail on the head for what people expect out of these blue strongholds now. The guy says, I've done 18 hours in prison before they let me out, or jail, sorry, before they let me out. Surely that's punishment enough. I've done my 18 hours. I'm shocked that is not the headline across the entire nation. I've done my 18 hours. Joe, is this in your opinion a signifier of what's going to happen coming up?
This is big because this is in their own home turf. Progressives cannot defend the real life consequences of their policies. I mean, when you're having people in Massachusetts challenge the progressive agenda, the Massachusetts state legislature passed a bill, dominated by Democrats, expected, granting illegal aliens driver's licenses in May. And, that in a state like Massachusetts, that's the end of the story. They've got a progressive dominated legislature. They do these things and they move on. No, irate citizens got it on the ballot. And now it is a major talking point during a general election campaign. Again, a general election campaign that the Democrat is definitely going to win. Maura Healey, who's the attorney general, got 5 times more votes than Jeff Deal, the Republican nominee, in their respective primaries. She's going to win. But with that much of a voting role dominance, he is dominating the narrative. This thing has been a gift to him. He has pointed out the major problems with the registry of motor vehicles in Massachusetts, how corrupt they are. They're already having trouble with security issues who they're giving licenses to. And now they're going to be giving driver's licenses to illegal aliens. And again, it's real life consequences. It's that guy with the axe in New York, and you can see the fear in people's eyes. It's always amazed me with driver's licenses for illegal aliens. 2 double yellow lines don't protect Democrat voters any more than they do Republican voters. If you've got someone who should not be on the road, should not be driving, and they cross that double lines, I mean, I'm sorry, you're dead. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican. It doesn't matter how much you love being enriched by diversity. This is a basic security issue. And, I find it absolutely fascinating that Democrats can't defend this on their safest of home territories. And heck yes, this is going to have consequences across the nation, I believe.
So it seems that despite all of these electoral gifts that are being handed to the Republicans, for some reason, it doesn't seem either willing or able to capitalize on this rather disastrous set of situations. Why is this?
Well, the fact is the Republican Party is still a divided party. It's divided between a grassroots that is dominated by Trump supporters and an establishment that is the establishment. They don't like America First populists. And you just saw in Arizona, the Senate is key this year. All we keep hearing, Republicans have to win the Senate. Mitch McConnell aligned Senate Leadership Fund just pulled $9 million in advertising out of Arizona. And Blake Masters, the Trump-aligned Senate nominee, just pulled within a couple of points of Democrat Mark Kelly in recent polling. So he's gotten closer than ever in polling. And Mitch McConnell's PAC said, now is the time to pull $9 million out. So this is a divide. There is a divide in the Republican Party. And, the Republican establishment loves the narrative of these Trump nominees are so dangerous. But it works both ways. There are a lot of America First supporters who don't want anything to do with these establishment picks. Mehmet Oz, to me, is the most interesting one, because you can define Oz as an establishment rhino, is the word America Firsters would use, and yet Donald Trump endorsed Oz. So, basically, either side can blame him here. But there are a lot of Republicans who are not going to vote for Mehmet Oz because they don't believe he is a real Republican. They've got to settle this divide, or else they're not going to be able to take advantage of these situations.
Well, it looks like they're on the verge of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Joe Schaefer, thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Coming up later in the show, we have an extended Talking Liberty on Ron DeSantis and the Martha's Vineyard hullabaloo. But up next, after this short break, we ask why big government can't seem to control itself. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Economist Ludwig von Mises said, prior intervention breeds later intervention. His position being that flawed interventionism brings about rectification after rectification to fix the problems the initial intervention created. And with it, well, we see the government's desperate bid for eternal busybody. Now, is this a trap that politicians are caught in, or is it a structural facility of their own device? Now, to discuss this, we're joined by economist and author and Uber fan of Mr. von Mises, Andrew Moran. Welcome aboard, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. I think Mark Angelides is the first person in radio history to quote Mises.
that makes me the second one, I think. I think you've done it many times. Now, Andrew, you did a Swamponomics TV segment recently, which I recommend everybody do go and watch on libertynation.com. That's Swamponomics TV, describing how Philadelphia's soda tax experiment has basically backfired and now requires further government meddling. What are the basics here?
So in 2017, well, technically 2016, they proposed a 1.5 cent tax on ounce tax on soda, and then it was passed in 2017. The results were not intended as the politicians wanted. Sales tumbled, which gave the government less revenue for their pre-K expansion and government school programs. Consumers shifted to other sugary beverages, or they actually went to different jurisdictions to buy soda pop. The city lost about 1,200 jobs, according to the American Beverage Association. Low-income residents were hurt. So because it's been a failure, there is a slight legislative push at City Hall to repeal it. There's no sunset clause, so who knows if it's actually going to be eliminated. So for now, Philadelphia residents have to endure a 1.5 cent an ounce tax on their favorite black liquid or green liquid.
Well, there's no such thing. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. Now,
Milton Friedman.
There you go. Right. Well, I am putting out the quotes by economists today. It's almost as though I've learned something from reading your columns, Andrew. 1,200 jobs lost, as you say, and people traveling across county and state lines to buy their beverages cheaper. Now, surely what the government can't be looking at is adding new programs on top to cater to the deficits and the problems they've caused. They wouldn't be that blind, would they?
Well, probably, because I think, yeah, you cite Mises and the whole, intervention begets intervention, which is a great summary of public policy making. But I think also public policy has turned into that old Groucho Marx joke where he says politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, then applying the wrong remedies. But you see this constantly throughout economic history. When the government intervenes in something, it creates a game of whack-a-mole where you start seeing these other consequences forming. So there's an economic principle. It's called the perverse incentive, or the Cobra effect. So essentially, this is that there was a town in New Delhi, and it had a snake problem about a century ago. And to eradicate this invasion of snakes, the government offered a viper bounty that paid farmers to kill these snakes. What happened? The problem was there was actually an artificial increase in supply because these farmers would actually breed these snakes in their basement and then sell it to the state when they sold it off. So that's not a fable. That actually really happened. And this is the problem when the government intervenes. They create all these other perverse incentives and problems and challenges, and then that needs a bailout. That needs a different public policy program.
Is it axiomatic, though, when the state gets involved in social and economic engineering? Is it axiomatic? Is it almost certain that we're doomed to further intervention to rebalance the, as Tim Donner of Liberty Nation likes to say, the unintended consequences of one-step thinking?
Well, it's hard to say, because I think with politicians, it's a lot of them thinking, well, that's not real socialism. My panacea is the real antidote to this chaos. I have the prescription for what ails us. But I also think it's I mean, not to dive too much. I mean, I guess this real intensive Econ 101 segment of LN Radio.
I need it.
But it's the old Frederick Bastiat law of what is seen and what is unseen. So we see everything that's in front of us that government does. The state builds the roads. It buys a subway car. It cuts the red ribbons. governments. But what is not seen is the money that's taken out of the private economy, and then you could have had private investment to whatever the subjective value was. So the private sector said they wanted to build a road here, not here, or the private sector wanted to buy more appliances as opposed to cutting more red tape, cutting more fancy ribbons for the politicians. So this is what happens, though. The government needs to intervene so it can have the photo ops to cut those red ribbons. They need to lead a crusade to justify their position. So they always need to find a problem in the economy, provide their solution, which is it's always government, and that's what festers, and that's how you have all these challenges in the economy. Why nothing ever gets solved, and why everything exacerbates and worsens.
I think that's best exemplified by the old saying that it needs to be seen to be doing something, which we hear people say without shame. We need to be seen to be doing something rather than we need to be doing something, which is crazy. Now,
I don't want them to do anything, though. I remember with the whole supply chain crisis, and everyone said, "Oh, Pete Buttigieg needs to do something." No, don't do anything. They made these problems worse. Just sit back.
May I point out that Pete Buttigieg went on paternity leave for, I believe it was 3 months, and nobody noticed, and the situation was steadily getting better while he was on maternity leave, and there was nobody there doing anything. And then he came back to work after spending admit, you need to spend time with your new family. Absolutely agreed. But then he came back to work. I think America might have been better off if he'd have become a stay-at-home dad, which might have been a better solution for America's shipping problems. Now, is there any end in sight, or is it perpetually going to be fixing the mistakes of the past?
Well, I think to answer that question, I think probably the best example of it would be the coronavirus pandemic. All the effects of what happened during the public health crisis are never going to subside whatsoever. Whether you think it was a wise idea or not, the government shut down the economy. But to fund the lockdown, the government ensured people didn't lose their jobs. The government founded the PPP, offer stimulus checks for consumers and businesses, provide relief to everyone. But then how did this need to be funded? The government needed to run deficits. What happened then? The Federal Reserve monetized deficits. But then this resulted in the 40-year high inflation. And then the Fed let inflation spiral out of control. So now what's going on? States are offering inflation relief checks to households across the states. Now you have a Fed tightening policy by raising interest rates, which will then trigger recession. What happens in recession? The government offers stimulus checks, provides all this government funding, provides all these, expanding the size and scope of government to, cure the economic recession and stimulate growth. And now this is going to be happening time and time again. And then now what does the government do? What does the Federal Reserve need to do again to support the government in its quest to stop a recession? Monetize the debt, cut interest rates, to repeat everything that's been going on wrong over the last 10, 20, 30 years. So the pandemic, if you want to talk about intervention and perpetual intervention and perpetual meddling, the coronavirus pandemic is a great example of that.
Andrew Moran, I think I'll leave us with yet another quote, this time by Fleetwood Mac. It looks like they're never going to break the chain. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. And remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation on WFYL 1180 AM out of Chester Springs, Philadelphia. Thanks for being here, Philly. Coming up after this break, we're talking Liberty with Scott DeSantis. Is it human trafficking when the federal government does it in the dead of night? Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
With all the happenings in Martha's Vineyard, Delaware, Chicago, and New York, we're going huge on this week's Talking Liberty segment and monopolizing the precious time of constitutional crusader, legal affairs editor, and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeSantis. Thanks for joining us, Scott.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Not all crusaders wear capes, some wear jabots. So, Scott, we have red state governors sending buses to avowed sanctuary cities, places that openly say they welcome illegal immigrants and illegal immigrants are safe here. To use the American phrase,
no one is illegal.
No one is illegal. Scott, where's the beef?
Well, the beef is that I think it is that they perceive an opening to attack a political enemy. And so the beef therein lies
they being
the
whom?
Opportunity. Well, the people who are attacking, it's a case of how dare you use these people as a political pawns? I'm now going to use them as a cudgel to beat you over the head with. That seems to me to be how it's laid out.
Okay, so I noticed that the Fourth Estate does seem particularly aghast at these happenings. Now, why is there no outcry? I really want to dig into the mechanics here, because what we're seeing is an outcry over Ron DeSantis, Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis, sending 50 illegal immigrants to Martha's Vineyard. That's what's really kicked this off. Obviously, there was some in Chicago. There's been from courtesy of Governor Greg Abbott. Arizona sent some out as well to the front door of Kamala Harris's
the
VP
Naval
residence.
Observatory. Yeah.
Now, they seem shocked at it. The Fourth Estate is shocked at it. You have Democrat politicians tearing their hair, rending their beards in a very biblical sense. But Joe Biden sending planes full of illegal migrants to unsuspecting cities. Now, these are unsuspecting locations because they don't know about it, in the middle of the night. And to paraphrase Peter Doocy and Karine Jean-Pierre, well, it was in the middle of the night. I wouldn't classify these as middle of the night. Well, it was 2 a.m. Sure. These have been happening for more than a year, and they've been greatly outlined by New York Post's Miranda Devine very, very well. So why the outcry for one and not the outcry for the other? Is it a case of it's okay when we do it, as British polemicist Paul Joseph Watson likes to say?
Yes, that's exactly
Right.
That's exactly what it is. Also, I would say that in the defense of the position that you ascribe to the big box media, I don't think that's wrong to ascribe it to them. I'm just saying, in defense of their position, you could say that while Biden is doing his midnight flights in order to manage the influx of massive influx of illegal aliens, or somewhat legal, depending on their status as asylum seekers.
I think what you're getting there too, Scott, is are they actual asylum seekers?
Well, before we get into that, I was just trying to make the point where it seems quite clearly that Mr. DeSantis is doing this to make a political point. And I don't think that Biden, a midnight flight to Cleveland, from San Antonio is to make a political point. Now, there are political ramifications to it, perhaps, but it's not done to make a point in fact, it's the opposite. It's kept in darkness and in secrecy, rather than, they have to sue and FOIA request if they're lucky to try to get the details of these things, rather than the opposite of the Abbott and DeSantis measures, which are designed to make a point publicly.
Yeah, I think it's a point that has really been made well in terms of bringing the attention to people, as they say, DeSantis Airlines bringing the border to your city. Now, let's talk briefly about the legality here, Scott. So we hear, as you say, in these sanctuary cities, no person is illegal. And I understand that a lot of the media and politicians are saying that, well, you can't treat refugees and asylum seekers like this. Now, I don't know US law particularly well at all, or British law for that matter. I may as well be completely open in that. But I'm under the impression that to be an asylum seeker, you have to report to a port of entry. Is that not correct?
There are certain reporting places that are required for asylum seekers. I know that is part of the law.
So I believe none of these reporting centers are along a 200-mile stretch of the Rio Grande.
I don't know that.
As in, the whole 200-mile stretch of the Rio Grande is not a reporting center. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. But I think that at least some of the persons who were transported to Martha's Vineyard did, in fact, check in at did formally apply for asylum protection.
Right. So that brings up my next question. We had the disaster relief fund, or the emergency relief fund, that Martha's Vineyard is in possession of, which I believe is to the tune of at least several $1 million. They said that was only, they couldn't use that fund for the 50 or so souls that turned up on the bus, because that was for people who have gone through the asylum process. So some of those people had gone through the asylum process, as far as you know.
Well, I'm basing some of this on the lawsuit that's funded by Mr. Soros that
we will get to that. Absolutely, yes.
Talking about, but I'm basing some of my information, Mark, on information that was contained in that complaint. So the reason why I'm using that information, because I think it's the most direct line from the mouth of one of the people, a Venezuelan refugee, told to their lawyer and then filed with the court. And according to that sort of chain of information, they have formally filed and are legally able to remain in the United States until there's more action on their request for asylum.
Okay, good. Now let's talk specifically about this lawsuit. So this lawsuit has been brought by, I mean, that's one of the two big developments, isn't it? There are two major developments in this particular issue at the moment. The first one is the Democrat sheriff who claimed he was investigating Ron DeSantis for kidnapping. Now, I do want your expert legal take on that. I
want to move down to his county, Mark, because clearly there is not much else going on in terms of crime. And
apparently not.
It's so awful when these elected officials decide to turn their very narrow and not easy challenges in terms of doing their jobs into like this platform to try to get national political attention. It always baffles me whether it's Republicans who do it or Democrats. You get some state attorney general who, instead of prosecuting like identity theft, decides they want to make a national point on guns or abortion or anyway. Side ran over.
That's all right. All you have to look at is it an election year? And I think we'll see why these things are happening. So, but the second point, the second big thing that's really come up is the lawsuit. And so you have several Venezuelan immigrants sent to Martha's Vineyards, and they're now suing Governor Ron DeSantis. So the first question, Scott, is these poor migrants, they cross the border, some of them illegally, as you point out, at least one individual going through the proper port of entry. They don't have a place to stay. They require food and shelter from the aggrieved citizens of Martha's Vineyards. But all of a sudden, they have a team of crack lawyers filing a class action. These folks must be real self-starters. And to come back to a point you said earlier, they appear to have the phone number of a certain Mr. George Soros. That cannot be true. Surely this is some kind of dog whistle.
That may be a bit rich, Mark. They are being represented by an organization that takes the lion's share of its funding from Mr. Soros. So I don't know that.
But he's just paying for it. He's not involved in it.
I don't think we could say he was on the phone, directing the filing.
I was obviously speaking hyperbolically, but he is paying for it.
He just
let's get that straight. He is paying for it.
Purses his lips and blows a little bit and sets his sailboats adrift on the ocean of progressivism, towards victory. So they're funded by Soros. The group is Alianzas Americas, and they get every year they cash big fat multiple 7-figure check from Soros, and this is part of what they're doing with their money. They're trying to get a class certified. So the class would be every person on the plane, the 50 migrants on the plane to Martha's Vineyard. And I did read like more than half of the 35-page complaint in order to understand what their arguments were.
Well, that's clearly your job done, Scott, if you read at least half of the 35 pages.
Oh, well, you don't need to read more than... Listen, I went a lot further than I needed to in order to assess the legal validity of it. I mean...
And what's your take?
The crux of the complaint is that when these people were on the plane itself, they were falsely imprisoned because at that point they couldn't leave the plane at any time. It is a baffling basis.
Well, Scott, I believe if that is the basis of a complaint, Spirit Airways is in big trouble.
It'd be one thing to say. It would be one thing to say like. So part of the thing is fraud. So the fraud is the idea that these people were promised they would get certain resources and jobs and so forth, housing assistance, once they landed in Massachusetts. And part of it rests on this quote unquote phony brochure that these DeSantis people allegedly printed up and gave to the people. But when you read the complaint, Mark, this is why it's important to read at least half of the complaint. When you read the complaint, you learn that those people weren't even given the brochure until shortly before they landed at Martha's Vineyard. So the idea that they were somehow sold a bill of goods vis-a-vis the brochure to be induced to get on the plane, when in fact even in the complaint, they don't even allege that they were given that brochure until, again, shortly before landing. It's a bit...
One point to bring up here, because I have been looking into this story quite in depth, is the brochure. It was not produced by Massachusetts. However, the information that is in the brochure was copied and pasted from the Massachusetts website and then put on a piece of paper. That makes it more
nefarious in the eyes of the counsel for the plaintiffs.
Of course, using somebody's own words against them is, I believe that's unconstitutional in America. Is that right?
And it belies, like the point of their complaint is that they left these people sort of high and dry. But yet apparently the details that were replicated in the brochure include details on how to contact the Massachusetts authorities for resources. And by the way, Mark, I am not an immigration attorney. That is an area of the law that is highly specialized. And you would never, if you could afford it, go to a sort of general type lawyer for immigration work. You'd only want to go to somebody who regularly practices in that area. It's so fraught with its own vocabulary, even rules and procedures. But immigration attorneys that I value their opinion, they say if you were going to have an immigration hearing, you don't want to be along the border, along the Rio Grande. Your client's much likely to get their asylum application approved if they're in like the Western District of Massachusetts or a Massachusetts court or some other court that doesn't see an ocean of these applicants every day, and because of that, tends to grant fewer applications.
Because justice is geography. We're talking with Liberty Nation's Scott DeSantis. Don't go anywhere. After this short break, we'll be back with Scott talking about Ron DeSantis' criminal liability. Will Ron DeSantis be running for prison 2024? We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott DeSantis. Just now, we've been talking about illegal migrants turning up in Martha's Vineyard. But now I wanted to turn our attention to what legal ramifications there are for Governor Ron DeSantis. Scott, Ron DeSantis, his office has responded by producing waivers that the immigrants signed. Now, surely that scuppers the lawsuit, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't, and it shouldn't, meaning without further investigation.
Right.
Presumably people who are non-English speakers who arrived at the United States in conditions far less than ideal. We don't know what their sort of health and mental conditions were. Like, you have to give any waiver that's given in the law, whether it's respect to civil law or otherwise, must be sort of done reasonably under reasonable conditions.
Must be entered into under reasonable conditions without duress or outside factors, right?
Yeah, we don't allow people to present their future spouses a prenuptial agreement at the altar and then say that it was a legal waiver of rights. Well, that's a tip. You know, present your premarital contractual agreements, you know, several days, if not weeks or months before the event. And the idea is that if you're under duress, extreme pressure, if it's a hot meal that's available to you by the DeSantis people, if you sign this form and you haven't had a hot meal in a month, then maybe you just sign the form and that's not a knowing waiver. You know, did you get a chance to read it? Was it published in a language that you understand? All these things are relevant.
Okay, good. So what are Ron DeSantis' criminal liabilities here? And are they serious criminal liabilities or are they more political attacks in your considered opinion as legal affairs editor?
Well, I think they're both. So let me tease that out to you.
Sure.
What I mean by I think they're both is I think that if people who have the capability of rendering criminal charges are politically motivated and they're willing to use their position in advancement of politics, then there is something there, because that just means that if you're willing to twist and bend the law to try to get X person, well, there's a lot of rope to work with. We have many laws that are often contradictory and confounding, but if you put somebody to task and say, this is a person, can we find something on them that they've done? then perhaps yes.
As Stalin once said, "Show me the." Was it Stalin who said, "Show me the man, I'll show you the crime"?
Or Beria, his that's probably who said it. That was who did the arresting for Stalin, until he himself, I think, got as one does get purged eventually.
He who lives by the sword.
Yes, but in a strictly criminal sense of like, did Ron DeSantis kidnap any of these people or induce a kidnapping? I would say the answer is absolutely no, and unlikely to yield traditional criminal charges. Now, we mentioned earlier a sheriff in Texas, Mark, I think it's Bexar County, Javier Salazar, has instituted a criminal investigation against DeSantis and others as a result of these horrible crimes that have been. Well, no, I'm sorry. I think that's not the answer. It's just that it's a politics thing. The question that you asked when we first started talking about this, why are they doing this? And of course, it's just hypocrisy. It's people will go to the ends of the earth to prosecute. Some people who have political powers and law enforcement powers will go to the ends of the earth to sort of combine those both to punish their enemies, versus, you can imagine how many crimes are taking place in that county at this moment. It's a triage unit. What crimes do you pay attention to? First of all, I don't even think this is a crime. Second of all, if it is, hotel rooms, room service, McDonald's coupons, flights to Massachusetts, is that really where you're going to focus your crime? And then you have the Twitterverse and some of the more lunaires of the left discussing human trafficking as if somehow this has morphed into I don't know.
Which kind of brings us back to where we started. According to, as you say, you said it was on the Twitterverse, but I'm seeing this from allegedly serious people in politics and the media who are using the words human trafficking, allegedly serious people.
The blood-brain barrier between the Twitterverse and allegedly serious people, Mark, grows thinner, sadly,
thinner
by the hour.
And so they're saying human trafficking. But again, it comes back to, it's okay when we do it.
Yeah. That again, it's just a looking outward and using and drawing inferences from the known facts to be used in the worst possible way towards one party, and then drawing the law as widely as constructed as can be to ensnare their activities as well. And on the other side, it's a narrowing of both. So it's no surprise that you come up with vast swaths of criminal or even civil liability on one side and sort of none on the other.
Now, this is clearly a story that is not going away and will last as long as there are people fighting for truth, justice, the American way, or at least until the midterms turn up. Scott D. Cosenza.
Mark, the taxpayers' money, that's what they're all fighting for, just to be...
Absolutely.
It's about those dollars.
Truth, justice, and the taxpayer dime. Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's almost all we have time for in this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I want to thank our guests, Joe Schaefer, Andrew Moran, and Scott Cosenza. And of course, you, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in. My final thought for this week relates to how those in power assure us that the policies and programs they promise will be transformative. And we've heard these vows for decades, and yet the world continues in its battle of chaos and order regardless. I'm reminded of the boast of Ozymandias, King of Kings, in the Shelley poem. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair, his pedestal reads. And the poem ends, nothing besides remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Well, that's a transformation indeed. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.